is Ebenezer Safwedu. I'm a business strategy consultant and a data specialist. I have here with me one person I've been following keenly for over a year, especially with his whole Enterprise DNA, his Sam Mackay and the whole team. And it's been fantastic following him. And I'm pleased and have a singular pleasure to interview him today. He's in the person of Brian Julius. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Ebenezer. Great to be here. Great to be here. I've been a big fan of your interviews for a while, and I'm happy to be a subject today.
Wow. So, Brian, can you tell us a little bit about yourself so that my viewers could appreciate the person we are talking to?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of background. So my training is in economics, and my undergraduate and graduate degrees are in economics and public policy with a specialization in econometrics. So I've always been very interested in data analysis and quantitative methods. And so I came out of grad school and started in consulting, and from there moved to the government. I really enjoyed the mission of the work the government did, and particularly kind of the intersection of data analysis and environmental policy. And so I worked for an agency called NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for 30 years. And I started as started as an economist and data scientist. We didn't call it data scientists back then; it was econometricians. But did that for about 12 or 13 years, and then moved into management, where I was managing data scientists, data analysts, financial analysts, geospatial analysts, and did that for about 15 years. And toward the end of my government career, I took a voluntary step way down back into doing project work. And it was during that project work that I worked on a big financial systems project that we were managing information in Excel that really needed a more robust system. And so we were working with Microsoft, and as part of that project, they introduced us to Dynamics 365 and Power BI. And at that point, I'd not heard of Power BI. This is back in like 2018. And I figured, as project manager for that project, that I should learn it. And so at night and on the weekends, I was consuming as much video content as I could find. So Enterprise DNA, SQL BI, Kerbal, Guy in a Cube, kind of all the big ones back, 4 years ago or so. And just really fell in love with it and kind of rekindled my love for data analysis and hands-on project work. And so in the course of that, I worked on that financial project, and in the midst of that, Sam Mackay called me and offered me a position as the chief content officer for Enterprise DNA. And so I was thrilled to kind of get back into doing that sort of stuff full time. And so took that position, retired from the government. And since then, I've been, working with Enterprise DNA and, for Sam, kind of leading our content development efforts. So our YouTube content, our course training content, webinars, lately been putting a lot of effort into the quarterly summits. So kind of working with the great data community that we've got out there in terms of having folks come in and present as part of that summit, and just basically trying to provide, value to the community, whether those are our members or just non-members out in the community, trying to give something back to a group and a profession that's given a lot to me over the years.
Wow. That's an impressive record from an economist working in government circles for 30 years, and now you're giving back to community. I mean, what you're doing is so amazing. I mean, if you've not actually followed him, try and follow his account on LinkedIn. He has over 5,000 followers. I remember recently you celebrated over 5,000 followers. I believe you should have more, because you're one person that come across always giving us the real life scenarios and the usefulness of data, which is one of the things that we'll be talking about today. And you are likely to also get in touch with the entire BI community through Brian, because he is currently he plays a pivotal role in the community. Recently, he gathered over 20 plus visualization experts around the world for the first of visualization summit, online summit that I've seen. Very amazing speakers. Some of them I've interviewed. And personally, I've been watching it over the couple of days to enhance my visualizations. So check out Brian on LinkedIn, Brian Julius on LinkedIn, and the whole Enterprise DNA squad. Thank you, Brian, for joining us today. And
my pleasure.
Our communication will be in two parts. Hopefully, it's going to be part one and part two. The first part would be talking about technically the tool Power BI, and the second part will be creating value in organizations. So those of you watching at home, you have a particular session where you would have hands-on. Brian is going to talk to us on some magic functions in Power BI and their use cases in the real world. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Ebenezer. Yeah, and I think, in terms of, DAX and kind of we were talking about kind of magic functions, it's interesting because when I started with Power BI, I was kind of all about DAX. It was learn as much DAX as I could. And, the people I thought really knew the most were the people who were writing the most DAX and the most complicated DAX. And so that's originally what I tried to do. And I've kind of since realized the error in that it's important to have, I think, a good understanding of DAX, but really what I try to do now is write as little DAX as possible. That I really have focused on kind of making sure my data model is really sound, that I've got that really solid star schema model, and that I've pushed everything I can push upstream as far as I can push it. And so, when you look at, probably the most influential thing I've ever read about, Power BI is, Matthew Roach's maxim of transformation, data transformation, which is, that you want to push data as far upstream as possible and downstream as necessary. And so what it really led me to was learning a lot more and focusing a lot more on pushing my transformations out of DAX and up into, either SQL or Power Query, and making sure that my DAX was really limited to those things that needed to be dynamic within the context of a report. And if it doesn't need to be dynamic within that reporting context, I really push that up. And so it's interesting how I love the problem solving aspect of DAX. I like the challenge of it, but kind of contradictorily, I like to write as little DAX as possible in my reports, because, it really, I kind of view it as a last resort. And so, kind of within that broader context, I do think there are some really critical aspects and kind of priority things to learn in DAX. And I don't know, are you familiar with, I put together something at the beginning of the year called the Atomic Function Challenge.
No.
Is that something? Oh, okay. Let me share screen and show you that.
All right.
So what this was, that I was, so what this was an attempt for myself to kind of study and learn all the DAX functions and all the M functions in a year. And so what I did was I looked at all the DAX. Can you see that?
This is on Novi Pro.
Pardon?
Is this on Novi Pro?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And
wow.
And so what I did is I kind of built this for originally just for myself, but then, thought, oh, this is probably something that the community could use as well. And I always think it's better to do learning in community because you just gain the benefit and perspective of other people with, kind of different ideas and different approaches. And so that diversity of thought, I think, just adds a tremendous amount to your learning. And it's why I'm always such a big fan of the DAX challenges and the Power Query challenges that, for example, Win Hopkins and Chandeep Chabra do on their channels, just because you see the thought process of other people who are attacking the same problem, and you really kind of understand the many different ways there are to do a given problem. And so what I want to do here is kind of have a way we could potentially kind of learn together in community the DAX functions and the M functions with a focus on kind of the most important functions in each stack. And so kind of coincidentally, when you look at it, there's about 360 DAX functions and about 720 M functions. And so if you divide those up over the course of a year, if you do one DAX function and 2 M functions a day, in the course of a year, you can cover everything. And it doesn't mean you're going to be an expert in all those, but you can develop a familiarity, you can develop an understanding in really just, 10, 15 minutes a day. And so this is something I do at the start of every day, and you go through and basically in this calendar, you kind of follow along. And so here's today's functions. And, search is the DAX function, time.minute and lines.fromBinary are the M functions. And the flashing dots, what we did is I had a small team of folks that I rely heavily on. So Greg Deckler, who's a Microsoft MVP and really one of the world experts on DAX. He's the author of probably one of my favorite DAX books, the DAX Cookbook. And so I got to know Greg through LinkedIn, and I talked to him and I said, hey, if you were going to rank the DAX functions and say what were the maybe 15% of DAX functions that are really worth focusing and learning on, which ones would you pick? And so he went through and did that priority ranking. And then for the M functions, I talked to Melissa de Korte and Rick de Groot, who are, two people who I have learned a tremendous amount from on M, and whose judgment I rely heavily on and think very highly of. And I said to them, rank the top 10 or 15% of M functions for me. And so what these flashing dots are every day are these are the priority functions. So if you're kind of going through this learning process, that you want to kind of develop a working familiarity with everything, but it doesn't mean you're going to master them. It just means you're going to be aware of them, what they do, and when they come about, when you have a situation that comes up, you can think, oh, okay, I've seen a function that does that. If I need to repeat text, I know I've seen a text.repeat function. And then you can go back and explore this in more detail. But I think that familiarity really helps with problem solving. And so in kind of focusing our attention, we've got kind of these priority functions. And so what I did before our conversation today is I went in and I kind of took the data that I had put together for that atomic function challenge and did some filtering and some arrangement of that and a little bit of analysis. And what I've got here is just the dummy variable slicer, which is a 1 if it was in Greg's top 20% of most important DAX functions. And then what I did is by category, looked at what percent of those functions are quote important in terms of in that top 20. And it's not necessarily what you might think. For example, the bottom is time intelligence. So there are 37 time intelligence functions. Only one of those gets designated as a top 20% function. And I think that's really because I think both Greg and I, feel strongly that you really don't need to learn those functions, that you can really replicate those yourself by just a good understanding of DAX filter and row context. So, there was a post I did a while back on LinkedIn that I called Travel Light Like a Hobo, which is basically that you can really simplify your DAX by not even bothering to learn those functions you don't need, because there are so many functions in DAX that are either duplicative of other functions or ones that you can easily build out yourself just with a kind of a fundamental understanding of the basic building blocks. So when we talk about, kind of the magic functions, I kind of look here at this kind of top layer of the percent important. And then what you can do is kind of look, for example, I think one of the real places where you see magic in DAX is table functions. That I think once you develop a basic understanding of DAX, the way to really elevate what you can do with DAX is to really develop mastery with table functions. And so, here are the ones that we, kind of talked about and designated as the most important. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but that's
I'm following keenly. I think the takeout from what I'm getting from you in most of your answers is that always focus on problem solving. Because you are an experienced user, the challenge with new learners or beginners is that you always want to show off than rather the use of what you do. So people tend to learn so many things that in the end may not be that useful. But what I get from what you're saying is that from a standpoint of usefulness and proper problem solving, what you need to do is to get to the basics. First, by making sure that your model is okay and you are doing your transformations right in Power Query Editor. And therefore, that minimizes the number of or the amount of DAX that a person would write. And
absolutely.
Once you do that, you simplify your life. Also, when you come into the DAX, you may not necessarily have to learn all the functions, even though you've given us a way to learn all the 360 plus functions that are in the DAX as of today, and also showed us how you can learn 720 M codes in a year, which you showed us in your challenge. And now you've moved on to telling us about how useful table functions are also. So I believe that viewers, we have a pro here who is telling us how easy to simplify our lives, not going through the routes that he may have taken 3 years to discover, and then making it easy for us. Thank you, Brian, for that.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. And I think you raise a lot of really good points there in that. I think new Power BI users, I've talked to a lot of people who I said, if you were to go back and know what you know now, what would you do differently? And almost to a person, they say, I would not try to learn everything at once. That I think and I made the same mistake, that you get super enthusiastic about this and you think, I want to just know everything there is to know. And you feel like, okay, if I study 3 hours a day, I can learn this much. And if I double that, I can learn twice as much. And the truth of the matter is you can't, that it doesn't scale that way, that there's only a certain amount of information you can take in and incorporate in a given amount of time. And that you really need to take that information and apply it before, at least I do, before it really kind of the concrete kind of sets, and you really understand that in a meaningful way. I can watch somebody like, like Sam or Rick DeGroot or Chandeep or, any of the really great instructors, show me something on video, and I'll look at it and go, okay, that looks simple. And then when you sit down in front of the computer to do it yourself, you're like, what am I doing? And you laugh probably because it's probably something we've all experienced.
Yeah, we've all experienced that.
And so, you need to take that time to apply the knowledge and really make sure that you understand it at a working level rather than just at a passive level. And so, you really can't rush that process. And I think, kind of learning the basics and learning, the fundamentals that we talked about, and then making sure you've done that over and over again at a working level, and then say, okay, what's the next thing I want to learn? And what I've tried to do here is to kind of pare that down in a methodical way so that you're not spending your time doing a lot of learning of things that aren't going to be really beneficial. And, so for example, a lot of these functions at the bottom, they're just not things you want to spend a big amount of time on. You want to be aware of them and know they exist in case you need them, but you really want to focus your effort up here. And there's kind of, I don't know if you saw over the weekend, there was a great scatter plot by Helen Wall and Leon Gordon.
Yeah. When the maximization of what you learn and how impactful it is.
Yeah, and kind of, how much effort something takes and how much impact it has. And I thought it was a brilliant analysis of kind of how to prioritize what you learn in Power BI. And what Greg and I and Melissa and Rick and I try to do is kind of something similar, which is to say, okay, what are the ways you can spend your time, and what are within DAX and within M, what are going to be the ones that have the highest payoff in terms of, really advancing your ability, as you say, to apply to practical problems.
Wow. I mean, like, this is very insightful, and I'm sure this goes to every kind of learning, that you should always have a mindset of making and having understanding than just having passive knowledge. So what Brian is telling us is that the way to have proper understanding of what you've learned is to put to practice and solve problems with them, and thereby you knowing exactly how useful it is and what goes into it, than rather just having passive knowledge. And I believe this is a very good and useful tip for every kind of learning that anyone wants to do. Thankfully, a lot of people have come to me asking, how can we learn DAX? And today I believe that if for nothing, this is an easy way to learn DAX. And that is what Brian is taking us through, letting us know the mistakes he may have done in the past and how we can actually correct it as a new learner or as a new user of Power BI. So thank you very much once again, Brian. And now I think you can walk us through how to go about it.
Yeah. So, I think, one of the things that I would do is, that, as I say, I think starting with the basics, starting with filter context and row context, and really making sure you understand that at a very fundamental level. And I think there are great online, course materials. We've got a lot in Enterprise DNA that focuses on that. I know there's a lot of other really, excellent videos and blog entries in the community on that. I think that's definitely the place to start. And then, from that, I think kind of moving into particularly the table and filter functions, that if you see here, the filter functions, and we can take a look at what those are. Those are the filter, keep filters, calculate table, the all family, and that's kind of the fundamental building block of manipulating tables with your table functions. And the thing that I find so powerful about this is what you can do is you can use this, and the question is, why is this so powerful? And for me, a lot of the problems that I deal with look at kind of membership in sets over time. So if you think about customer churn, if you think about HR and attrition analysis, if you think about processing trouble tickets, for IT, or orders for, inventory, it's membership in sets over time. It's, these are customers at this time period. These are customers at this time period. What overlap is there, and what are the differences in those sets? And it's through the table functions that you can really build out that logic. And I'll show you kind of a silly example that I did. And this is so one of my favorite people in the community is Kavita Behara, and she does a weekly thing called the weekly chart. And each week she puts out an infographic about a different visual and different chart type, and talks about the pros and the cons and when you'd use it, and kind of sometimes the history of it. And it's a brilliant series. And so what I try to do is every week I try to replicate one of her chart types in using DAX, or using custom visuals, or using R, or some ways that I replicate it. And this was one that she did on Venn diagrams. And it's, as I say, it's kind of a stupid example I did of, kind of looking at things I like versus things my cat likes. And I wanted to, just show kind of dynamically what the intersection is. And so if I click on, here's, sitting in shopping bags, if I check this off on my list, it changes here what the overlap and what is exclusive to my cat's list. And so, the ability to kind of analyze this set membership, if I give her external tools, that takes away from my list, adds to the intersection. And looking at this kind of set membership issue, I think is hugely, hugely important, and is something that you can extend to an enormous range of practical problems. That anything that looks at changes in groups over time, you're going to end up using those sort of table functions for. And I'll show you another area where I think it's really, really important to focus, which is there's a concept called offsets. And basically what offsets are, and I can show you in, and this is something, again, kind of going back to Melissa de Korte and her work in M. So she has and I can show you this in the Enterprise DNA site. Let me pop that up real quick. So what she has done is she's put together an incredible date table, and put together the M code for that, which is really, I think, the best calendar table out there. And what she's done in the course of that is built in these offsets. And let me just pull this up for you. Here we go. And this is something that's available free to everybody. You don't have to be a member. And so what she's got is this code for the date table. And what this does is it produces a really comprehensive date table in Power Query. And we can take a look at this. Oh, I cut this down for this particular analysis. But let me pull up. Sorry, let me quickly pull up
The entire thing.
a report that uses this. Here we go. So this is our membership report. And I'll show you real quickly here. And this, even though it's in Power Query, it has a huge implication for DAX. And so if we go to our dates table, what we see is a series of offsets here. So we've got month offset, quarter offset, year offset. There's a week offset. And what this does is this is a sequential number that sets the current period dynamically equal to 0, the previous period equal to -1, the next previous period equal to -2, and the next forward period 1 and 2. And so what you can do is you can move throughout time in DAX without having to worry about crossing year boundaries and quarter boundaries and month boundaries. That it all goes based on sequential. And so the way in DAX, obviously working with years is very easy because years are they're just numbers, they're sequential numbers. And so what this does is this eliminates the need to learn the vast majority of time intelligence functions. And so if you learn how to work in DAX with offsets, it simplifies dramatically the work you have to do on time intelligence. And so I think once you've got kind of the fundamentals, learning the table functions and then learning how to manipulate offsets and kind of travel back and forth through time in using DAX, to me, at that point, you can work through almost anything. And then it just becomes a matter of, kind of learning the specifics of the individual problem that you're dealing with. And that's where kind of the familiarity that comes in the atomic function challenge really helps, is you can, no matter what problem you come across, you can say, oh, okay, I've seen a function that does that. Let me take a look. And, you can take a, everybody I think who is serious about DAX has a copy of, the definitive guide to DAX. I think, the Greg's DAX cookbook, I think is another critical reference. And so, you kind of take those references off the shelf and then, learn kind of the specifics of what you need to learn. And to me, that's been a winning formula that, I think that combined with the fact that I think for most of us, our work projects and reports only cover kind of a limited span of topics. And so you can kind of master what you need for your work. And maybe for many people that's enough. But what I felt it was pretty limited. And so what I started doing was answering forum questions and, kind of getting out of my comfort zone in terms of saying, okay, here are data structures and business problems that I've never seen before. And how do I work the DAX in those? And so, I kind of liken it to, to mixed martial arts, that you may learn to fight in one particular style, but when you get into the forum and, other people's business problems, you have to learn a lot of different styles because the one style that you've got may not be sufficient to address their problems. And so it really stretches and expands you, I think, in a great way.
So, I mean, you've just taken us through one other issue on problem solving, which is a set problem. That's, if you understand the set problem, it can help you actually answer a lot of business questions. especially these are useful insights for businesses. That's the churn analysis, trying to find out which customers were in a particular period as against which customers were in another period. And this brings back to the fundamentals of DAX, which is always the logic. If you are able to understand and break it down into the logic, what is the problem really about? Because a churn analysis, like you just said, is a set problem, trying to find either a union or intersection or an exclusion to know where either a particular customer would belong to a particular group or not. And that is something that we need to appreciate before even we come to that. I always tell people that you need to understand the logic first, solve the problem on paper. Then you can find what functions, which is what we are going to talk about very soon, which functions would help you. Because if you don't know what problem that you are facing, then the functions do not become useful to you. You would have to first go through that iteration of understanding the business problem. Like Brian just showed us that an attrition problem is just a set problem. You have set A, set B. Set A contains people who were recruited in a particular time, and set B would be people who were recruited in a particular, or staff at a particular time, and staff at a particular time. The intersection is the staff who were at this time and also at that time. And those who left would be those who will be outside the set. And in this case, you can now think about, okay, what function would help me write this? Then you look at it that these are two separate tables. What table function do I need to use? And therefore, you now go into, with what Brian just showed us, if you've learned this challenge of learning every day, 15 minutes, a DAX function, by the end of the year, you would have done pretty much everything. But most importantly, like he said, you would have to practicalize it. And how do you get this? By participating in forum or fora, where in these communities, people are asking questions, and you now get an understanding of something that you are not used to, because in your business, you may be solving particular problems every day. If, like, for instance, personally, I'm in the energy sector and I'm solving particular problems that are akin to the energy sector, which means I'll be using particular kind of DAX functions over and over again. But in the business community, you meet people from diverse backgrounds solving different problems. And that will challenge you to learn different functions and how useful the 360 functions that you have learned would be useful. He also just told us about the offset function, which I believe that if you go to the Enterprise DNA website, you can copy Melissa's calendar table and then use the offset to reduce the number of time intelligence that could be in your DAX functions. I think that that is pretty much another point that we ought to learn. All right.
And yeah, we've got there's some really good videos just up on YouTube that Melissa has done in terms of applying those offset functions to practical problems. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And what you said really resonated with me, which is you've got to be able to articulate the business logic. And before you start writing any DAX at all, I talk about rubber ducking, and we talk about it in a debugging sense. But I think, that concept of whether it's, to a rubber duck or just out loud, or to a coworker, is articulating, okay, that what I've got is I've got two sets, and I've got at this time period and that time period, and the intersection of those sets is going to be the people who are in both time periods. On the left-hand side is going to be basically the group that's in set A but not set B are going to be the attrition, and then the group that's in set B but not set A are going to be the new people. And if you articulate that, then it's a really, if you can articulate the business logic, then I think it's a really straightforward thing to say, okay, and particularly if you master variables in DAX, because I think that's another critically important thing to master, because what you can then do is you can take each piece of your logic and you can build that into a separate variable. And you can build it so that it really makes logical sense. And, the people who are really great at DAX, I see what they do is, they kind of integrate everything into a very small number of lines in this really elegant way. And I don't do that. What I do is my DAX tends to be pretty verbose, that it's a lot of lines. And the reason is that I want to make sure the business logic is clear. And so I build out a lot in variables. I build out kind of pretty extensive structures to make it explicit what I'm doing. I'm to both other people and myself, because you're either going to come back in 6 months and say, what did I do here?
Yeah.
Or you're going to turn over. I mean, it's very rare, I think, that kind of cradle to grave in a report that one person manages that report its whole lifespan. And so it's probably true that 2 or 3 or more people are going to end up administering and managing and maintaining that report. And so the clearer you can make it, the better. And so, I've always been a big fan of the idea of make it work and then make it fast. And part of making it work for me is making the DAX produce accurate, reliable results in a way that's really clear to the person, to the developer, or to whether that developer is me or somebody who subsequently takes over the report. And I think documentation is a big part of that. I think writing comments is a big part of it. But I also think trying to write your DAX in a way that is intuitive and consistent with the business logic is quite important. And it's not always the most efficient way. And so I don't want to overstate that, because I think sometimes for optimization purposes, you have to write DAX in a way that is not necessarily the most transparent, but it's the most efficient. But I think starting with that clarity and that transparency, and then moving into more complex constructs if you need to for efficiency and optimization purposes, that's something that's always worked well for me.
I think that, the takeout here is that as a beginner trying to learn DAX, always get the business logic right in the verbose area. It's just like learning any language. You speak a lot so that everybody can get clarity. With time, you look for words that can explain probably a whole line of vocabularies that you've used to make it efficient. But in the beginning, to make it easier on you and also for reference's sake, write the code in such a way that is meaningful to anybody that picks it. That does not need to go through a lot of things to find out what did I do here. All right. So Brian, back to the important functions.
Mm-hmm.
If you would take us through probably some of them so that we could actually appreciate how it is, so that somebody who wants to quickly learn DAX would know that, okay, these are the top functions I need to learn because I'll be using it every day, as well as going through the challenge.
Yes, let me reshare that. Let me reshare that file that I showed earlier. Yeah. So if we take a look here, in terms of the most important ones, it's 20%, and I think of the 361 functions, there were 73 that in talking to Greg, we said, okay, those are really the most critical ones to learn. And that list is one that I can certainly share with you, and I'd be happy to share this this file. As you can see, there's a lot of them here, like variable, union, treat as, these top end, these table functions and filter functions, selected values, select columns, the table and filter functions being really critical. The other ones that really solve, I find, a large number of business problems. And interestingly, when we looked at this, the parent-child functions, the hierarchy functions, there are only 5 of them, and all 5 were deemed in that top 20%. So, really looking at, if you look at kind of report, particularly in one of the places I found that being incredibly valuable is problems dealing with organizational hierarchies. And so reporting assignments and, who reports to whom. And, there was one I remember working on with a member about, completion of performance reviews by multiple, sign off by multiple levels of supervisors. And it's that kind of level comparison that you can really get at through the path functions. And so I would say, those are hugely important if you deal with those type of problems. Obviously the aggregation functions, the, kind of your basic, sum x, min x, those are kind of at the root of, anything you're going to be doing. Date and time, these are kind of the fundamental building blocks of what you need to build out your own time intelligence functions. So if you look, the date and time are quite important. The time intelligence, 97% of them you can just ignore, because once you've got these in your bag, you can build out what you need. The filter functions, which really go hand in hand with the table functions, those are critically important. The information functions, in terms of has one value and is in scope, those are going to be really helpful in terms of particularly dealing with totals and subtotals and fixing the, one of the things we get all the time from people first learning DAX is, why don't my totals work? And, we've got Greg Phillips, one of our experts on Enterprise DNA, has put together a really great section on the forum that's available to everybody on kind of patterns for fixing totals. And the has one value and is in scope functions are critical on that. The logical functions are super important, if and switch, particularly if you've got more than one alternate condition in your if. So rather than writing a lot of nested ifs, that switch statement is incredibly flexible. In is another one that is super important in terms of kind of that set membership issue that we talked about. The path we talked about in terms of hierarchy. And if you deal with those kind of issues, these will really provide a tremendous amount of power in dealing with that hierarchical relationship in an analytical way. Related and used relationship. This is this is kind of getting to the data modeling. We've got evaluate, return, and var, which the two variable statements, as we talked about, are essential for breaking down complex problems. I think you really can't write complex DAX without doing it in variables. That there was a period before I got into Power BI when Power BI didn't have variables, and I actually can't even imagine what DAX was like, in that time before variables. Were you using it back then?
No, I had to probably write maybe 3-4 different formulas before you referenced them. That was pretty much what we used to do in 2017 thereabout.
Yeah, and that's such an important thing to really understand, and that's a really kind of critical fundamental aspect, which is understanding that variables in DAX are truly constants. They're not necessarily variables in the way you might think of variables in other programming languages. And so understanding that concept of variables being constants and what that means, I've actually got a pretty long video on that. I know others have done videos on that. That's for somebody learning DAX, that's an essential fundamental concept that you've got to make sure you understand clearly. We've talked about the table manipulation and how important that is. And then the last one are really the text functions. And there's just a lot you can do with these. And probably my favorite of the bunch is CONCATENATEX, because what you can do with CONCATENATEX, I think this is one of the most important functions for debugging, in the sense that DAX measures can only return scalars, they can't return tables. But the one exception to that is you can kind of trick DAX into quasi-returning a table and a measure by using CONCATENATEX. It's still returning a scalar, but what it is it's a scalar separated by delimiters. And if you use this UNICHAR function, so UNICHAR 10 is a hard return. And if you use CONCATENATEX and UNICHAR 10, what you can do is have a measure that looks like it's returning a table. And that is critically, critically important and helpful when you've got a complex DAX measure that is doing a lot of table functions and it's not returning the right result. So particularly where you've got like an all selected or an all except around some of your table functions, and you've got slicers and you've got very complex filter context, that CONCATENATEX UNICHAR 10 trick, and I've written about that on LinkedIn, is an incredible way to debug what's going on in a complex measure. So, in terms of, kind of the kind of quickly touring through those 73 important functions, that's kind of the quick roadmap for if you can master the fundamental concepts of filter, context, row context, context transition, breaking down by variables, and then these 73 functions, you will have all the DAX power you could possibly need.
Wow. This is insightful. I mean, this is cutting short your learning curve. I mean, if you've been following us, Brian is trying to help new users to probably learn efficiently in especially the DAX that we're talking about. He's given us about 73 very relevant DAX functions that you can learn. I believe that with this, you can actually take them one by one, look for the documentations on them, or from SQL BI, Marco Russo and Ferreira has done so much on that. So you could pick them one after the other and then learn them with their use cases and then apply them, and then you can see what you can get out of. I mean, before we sign off, I would like you to actually show us the magic with the concatenate and the UNICHAR, if you have a perfect example that we can follow through.
Yeah, let me find that for you. And look, before we jump off, we got a minute. Let me just show you one of the things I've done is in my. You mentioned the SQL BI DAX guide, and I think that is just a magic resource. And I've actually built that into my external toolbar so that it's available with one click. And the great thing about this is you can search for any function. You can search for groups of functions. So, if you want to look for your table functions, your parent-child functions. And what I actually did is I web scraped this information, and that's where the designations in the atomic function challenge come from in terms of the categorizations that Alberto and Marco used for their functions. And so this is an absolute gold mine of information. And one of the things I like so much about it is that if you go into a particular function, let's just say count rows, what they've got is they've got examples and they've got related functions and then they've got related articles. And so, you can really delve very deeply into each of these key functions. And so, this is just an absolute treasure trove of information. And they've got DAX do where you can actually take and try this code live on the Contoso database, and just a great resource for learning. So wow. Thanks to those guys for that. So yeah, let me quickly pull up. I didn't pull it up ahead of time, so it may take me just a little bit to find it, but so this is the Enterprise DNA forum, and NATEX, and then UNICHAR. Let me just quickly down. This is one I haven't looked at in a while, but let's pull it up and see what it shows. I'm just trying to find a company that meets both conditions. So just show you. All right, sorry. Let me just pull up one other one. Okay, here we go. So this is a post I did about CONCATENATEX and UNICHAR 10, and basically talks about how you can use this to debug. And what it does is it shows how in a kind of a complex filter context, you can use this code to return what looks like a table and is actually a measure.
Wow.
And so I can provide that reference to you. So sorry I hadn't prepared kind of pulling that up. So I apologize for the time to search for that.
That's okay. So I think you just have to provide us with the link, and then we can take a look at it.
Yes, I'd be glad to do that.
All right. So all too soon, viewers, we've come to part 1 of my interview with Brian Julius. It's been insightful so far, trying to take us through how easy it is to learn some DAX functions, to short circuit your learning curve from pros and the mistakes that they've made. I mean, one critical thing that I've picked out is that you cannot learn it all. It's best you actually focus and then make maximum use of your time by making sure that you look at the most critical ones that you can solve problems with, and most importantly, always apply what you've learned. Brian, what are your last words for any learner for DAX?
You know, I think the advice I give is to stick with it. That there are times in DAX you just feel like, I'm not making progress, I'm not understanding this. You know, all this study just isn't helping. And DAX is one of those things that, at least from my experience, it's not a steady learning curve. That you'll feel like you've plateaued and like, I'm not getting it. It's not clicking. I don't understand, this concept or that concept. And then all of a sudden one day you'll be working on a problem and the light will click on and you'll be like, I get it. I understand, whether it's context transition or, table functions or, scalars versus tables or, whatever that is, kind of one of the ones that is constantly a challenge to me is all selected. There's so much in terms of that shadow filter context in all selected. It's very complicated. And, it's taken me a couple of years now to really understand what I think all selected is doing. And, stick with it. And what you'll find is you'll get those kind of magic light bulb moments at times you don't expect it. But stick with it. Those moments will definitely come.
All right. I mean, the final words has been that stick with it. If you're not getting it, I mean, you're not alone. With time, one day, the Eureka moment would come. And that's why my company is called Eureka Business Intelligence, because we believe that is how insights are gotten. You may be with a particular problem for so long, but if you stick with it enough, one day it will just pop up with that light bulb for you to get the solution and the understanding that this is it. Thank you so much, Brian, for part 1 of the interview. It's been insightful. Kindly check him out on LinkedIn and the Enterprise DNA team, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel for more of this. We'll join Brian again with part 2, where he talks about the value that companies can get and how to really get value for data in organizations based on his experience. Thank you for joining us. See you same time next week.
Thank you, Ebenezer. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat with you.